New Orleans, 1839. Before dawn, the city holds its breath. A young wife wakes to an empty bed and follows footprints of silence to the river's fog. Lanterns flicker, crates thud, a red seal glows like spilled sin. In one heartbeat, vows splinter, innocence drowns, and a secret older than the house itself rises to the surface. Duty or desire, silence or truth. One choice will demand everything, and the morning will remember.
It is of no
If this opening
consequence,
gripped
Father.
you, tell us where you're listening from. We love meeting our audience across oceans and time zones. And share. What do you cherish most in period romances? The forbidden love, the ruthless society, or the triumph of truth at dawn? New Orleans, Louisiana, winter of 1839. The gas lamps had not yet dimmed when Sophie Beaumont awoke in the darkness. The room was cold, despite the lingering warmth of velvet drapes and the dying embers in the hearth. A pale strip of mourning crept along the carved moldings of the ceiling, soft and uncertain, like the breath of someone who had not yet decided to live or die. She reached to the side, expecting the familiar weight of her husband's body beneath the embroidered counterpane. But the space was empty, cold, as if it had never been touched by human skin. Her fingers lingered for a moment on the fine linen sheets, uncertain whether to feel fear or relief. Silence pressed against the walls like a second skin. Outside, the Spanish moss swayed in the trees, whispering secrets no one dared translate. Sophie sat up slowly, her long braid brushing the curve of her shoulder, and reached for her robe. The floor beneath her bare feet was freezing. She did not light a lamp. She didn't want to be seen. Crossing the hallway, she passed the portrait of Charles's first wife, Camille, forever immortalized in oil and gold leaf. Her painted eyes followed Sophie as they always did, serene and accusing. Sophie paused, exhaled, and continued on silent steps. The corridor ended at the servants' stairs, narrow and winding like the throat of a secret. She descended with care, pressing her hand against the cold stone wall for balance. When she reached the lower floor, she heard the front door close with the gentlest of clicks. She moved to the window, careful not to disturb the heavy velvet curtain. Through a gap in the fabric, she glimpsed Charles's tall frame crossing the courtyard, his coat collar turned high against the wind. The air was thick with river fog, curling like smoke around his boots as he disappeared past the iron gates. Sophie did not hesitate. She slipped through the side door in her slippers, pulling her pelisse tight around her nightdress. The winter air sliced through the silk like a blade. Her breath came out in trembling clouds. But her heart beat with a rhythm far colder. She followed the gravel path toward the river's edge, guided by instinct and dread. The Mississippi loomed ahead like a ghost, its waters black and swollen with secrets. The fog clung to the banks like a jealous lover. Sophie stayed low behind a cluster of cypress trees, the hem of her gown soaked with dew and mud. Then she saw him. Charles stood near the boat dock, flanked by two men dressed in coarse coats and wide-brimmed hats. A lantern swung low from one of their hands, casting a sickly yellow light over the scene. Wooden crates were being unloaded from a flatboat, silent and heavy, like coffins. Charles bent down, opened one, and removed a stack of documents sealed with wax. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. Even from a distance, she recognized the seal. St. Bernard Parish Slave Registry, blood red against pale parchment. One of the men asked something in a low voice. Charles replied, his tone sharp and precise. He handed over a pouch that clinked with coin, then snapped the folder shut. She could not move. Her feet had taken root in the earth. The man she had married, a man who had kissed her hand at the altar with solemn promises, was a dealer in human lives. Something inside her cracked without a sound. The fog thickened, swallowing the men as they returned to the boat. Charles lingered a moment longer, his back to her, his silhouette regal and distant. Sophie watched him touch his pocket watch, then glanced toward the sleeping house. Her prison. She turned before he could see her. Her steps back up the hill were slower, as if gravity had become personal. The hem of her gown dragged behind her like a shroud. When she reached the veranda, she paused to catch her breath. Her reflection in the window startled her, a pale woman, her eyes wide, her mouth parted in silent despair. Inside, the fire had gone out. She slipped back into her room, undressed in the dark, and sat on the edge of the bed. Charles returned minutes later, smelling faintly of salt, smoke, and something bitter she could not name. He said nothing, neither did she. He climbed beneath the covers, exhaled, and turned away. Sophie lay beside him, eyes open to the ceiling, the silence between them now a wall she would never cross again. Dawn broke slowly, but it no longer meant beginning. It meant knowing. And nothing in the world was heavier than that. The chandeliers of the Beaumont ballroom shimmered like constellations trapped in crystal. Dozens of flames danced within cut glass, casting trembling reflections on polished marble and silken gowns. Outside, the magnolia trees swayed gently in the evening breeze, their fragrance seeping through the open windows like a memory trying to return. But inside the house, everything glittered, everything smiled, everything pretended. Sophie stood at the top of the staircase, her gloved fingers trailing along the gilded banister. Her gown, seafoam silk with delicate silver embroidery at the cuffs and neckline, had been chosen for her by Charles's steward 3 days earlier. The bodice clung tightly, the sleeves tapered elegantly, and the skirt flowed like water when she moved. But beneath the silk and boning she felt stiff and hollow, as though the fabric wore her rather than the other way around. Lisette appeared at her side, adjusting the folds of Sophie's skirt with care and affection. She was dressed simply in a muslin gown and navy ribbon, appropriate for her station, though her bearing was always dignified. "You look like the moon herself, madame," Lisette whispered, her eyes soft. Sophie offered a quiet smile. "Then I suppose I must shine, even if I'm only reflecting someone else's light." Lisette's expression faltered just briefly. She knew her mistress was not speaking of poetry. The ballroom below was already full. Gentlemen in cravats and satin waistcoats moved like chess pieces through clusters of powdered ladies who sparkled in lace and pearls. Laughter, shallow and carefully modulated, echoed beneath the music of a string quartet. And Charles, always precise, always polished, stood near the fireplace speaking to Judge Vallon and a pair of businessmen whose faces Sophie did not recognize. His posture was proud, his voice calm, as if nothing had happened, as if the world had not cracked in two. Sophie inhaled slowly and descended the staircase. Every step she took reminded her that she was being watched. She felt eyes on her neck, on her waist, on her hands. But she smiled. She greeted guests. She accepted compliments. She thanked them for coming. Her movements were graceful, practiced, and painfully distant from the storm within. Lisette stayed near, moving silently between trays and candlelight, eyes always scanning the room, with the alertness of someone who had learned early to read danger in stillness. An hour passed, then another. Sophie spoke with dignitaries and dowagers, clinking her glass with ladies who praised her poise and envied her jewels. But as she stood near the tall windows draped in green velvet, something shifted in the room's atmosphere, barely perceptible, like the change in air before a thunderstorm. She turned her head slightly and saw him. He was tall, but not in a way that begged for attention. His presence was quiet, even still, but undeniable. His coat was worn and dark, without embroidery or vanity. His hair, black as riverstone, was tied at the nape of his neck, with a few loose strands curling near his cheekbone. His eyes, dark, unreadable, heavy with thought, seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. He was speaking with the governor's secretary in a corner, gesturing once, then folding his hands behind his back. His expression did not shift. He did not smile. Sophie felt a shiver pass through her, as if the fabric at her spine had been plucked by invisible fingers. "Who is that man?" she asked Lisette, who was adjusting silverware nearby. Lisette followed her gaze, then whispered, "That's Monsieur Morel, Gabriel Morel, The Creole gentleman who translates legal documents for the commission. Some say he once taught philosophy in Paris, but no one seems to know quite where he came from. He looks... Sophie stopped, realizing there was no appropriate word. Lisette supplied one for her, softly. Dangerous? No. Sophie shook her head. He looks silent, like a book with no title. Lisette said nothing, but her lips pressed together with unease. Moments later, as if the music itself guided her steps, Sophie crossed the room and stood near the refreshment table. She did not look directly at him, but she knew he had noticed her. The space between them felt weighted. Then, without preamble, he moved closer. "Madame Beaumont," he said, his voice low and smooth, touched with an accent that echoed the cadence of old Saint-Domingue. She turned to him, surprised he had addressed her by name. "You seem to know who I am," she replied, keeping her tone light. He inclined his head, not quite smiling. "Everyone knows the lady of the house, but few expect her to wear sorrow so gracefully." Her breath caught. "You presume a great deal, monsieur. Forgive me." His gaze did not waver. "I have a mind for poetry and the misfortune of speaking it aloud." Sophie was suddenly aware of everything. The weight of her earrings, the tightness of her corset, the rhythm of the music behind them. She had been spoken to in admiration, in flattery, in instruction, but never like this. Never with such quiet clarity. "You speak as though you are not afraid of being misunderstood," she said. Gabriel tilted his head. "I find that those who hide the most are often the ones most eager to be seen." Before she could respond, a shadow fell over them. Charles. He approached with a glass in each hand, smiling at his wife with cool civility. "There you are, darling. I've brought you your cordial." He handed it to her, then turned to Gabriel with a touch of calculated charm. "And you must be Monsieur Morel." The man of many languages and very few appearances. Gabriel bowed slightly. "I find silence often speaks more eloquently than applause." Charles' smile did not falter, but his tone sharpened almost imperceptibly. "This house favors those who understand when to speak and when to vanish." Gabriel met his gaze without blinking. "Then I shall not overstay my welcome." He looked once more at Sophie, his eyes softening by the smallest fraction. "Madame," he said gently, then walked away without another word. Sophie stood frozen, her heart drumming with inexplicable force. Charles placed his hand at the small of her back. "Interesting man. I'm not certain I like him." She did not respond. Charles's fingers pressed slightly deeper. "Be careful who you encourage with your eyes, my dear. Some men mistake politeness for invitation." She turned to him slowly, meeting his gaze with a calm he did not expect. "Then let them be disappointed." He said nothing, only stepped away, his jaw tightening. Later that evening, as the ballroom emptied and the music faded into memory, Sophie sat at her vanity, unpinning her hair. The silence in the room was thick. The fire crackled softly, casting her reflection in gold and shadow. Lisette entered with warm water and a towel. She placed them gently on the table, then asked, "Was he unkind to you again?" "No," Sophie said almost in a whisper. "Not unkind, just careful." Lisette tilted her head. "And the other one?" Sophie's eyes met hers in the mirror. "I don't know what he was," she said, "but he saw something I wasn't ready to show." She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind swept through the magnolias once more, whispering stories the house was not yet ready to tell. The rain had come softly at first, like a whisper brushing across the windows, but by dusk it had gathered strength and sorrow. Thunder murmured in the distance, low and threatening, like a secret only the sky dared carry. The air in the Beaumont house was heavy, thick with the scent of damp stone, beeswax polish, and roses that had begun to rot in their vases. Sophie sat alone in the library, the velvet curtains drawn tight against the storm, a single oil lamp casting golden pools over the sea of leather-bound volumes. Shadows danced across the carved cornices, and the silence around her felt profound, as if the house itself were holding its breath. She had come looking for solace in scripture, not out of piety, but out of habit. Her hand reached for the prayer book she had used since her arrival. It was a small, black-bound volume, delicate, unassuming, the kind of book meant to soothe the soul without demanding attention. But tonight, as she opened it, something foreign slipped from its spine. A folded piece of parchment, neatly pressed and sealed not with wax, but with a faint smudge of ink, 3 dots arranged like a triangle. Her fingers hesitated, hovering over the letter, before finally lifting it to the light. The paper was crisp, the handwriting elegant but spare. At first glance it appeared meaningless, a list of names perhaps, or a sequence of abbreviated places. But then she saw it. The repetition, the pattern, the subtle slant of certain letters. A code. Her heart fluttered with a strange mix of curiosity and dread. She had seen Charles write in similar fashion when corresponding with his associates. But this felt different. It carried no seal, no pretense of formality, only quiet urgency. She looked again at the spine of the prayer book. Someone had placed it there deliberately, perhaps for another pair of hands altogether. She should have returned it. She should have burned it. Instead, she folded it carefully, slid it into her sleeve, and extinguished the lamp. The storm had softened to a hush of drizzle by the time Sophie slipped outside. She moved quickly across the courtyard, her boots soaking through as she crossed the flagstones toward the small chapel nestled between the cypress trees. It was a humble structure of stone and stained glass, rarely used since the estate had grown too large and ostentatious for such simple devotion. But Sophie knew it had not been empty lately. The door creaked open at her touch. Inside, the chapel was dim, lit only by the silver light of the moon through rain-specked windows. Wooden pews lined the aisle like forgotten soldiers, and the scent of candle wax lingered in the damp air. He was there. Gabriel stood near the altar, one hand resting on the back of a pew, the other holding a small cloth bundle. His coat was still damp, his hair unbound, curling softly at his jaw. When he turned to her, he didn't speak. He didn't need to. She stepped forward, heart pounding, the parchment warm against her skin. "I found something," she whispered. "In a book. I believe it wasn't meant for me." He studied her for a long moment, then reached for the bundle in his hand and set it down. "Let me see it." She hesitated, then pulled the note from her sleeve and handed it to him. Their fingers brushed, just for an instant, and something passed between them. Not heat, exactly, not even longing, but the unbearable ache of being understood. Gabriel unfolded the paper and read in silence. His brow furrowed, his jaw tensed. At last, he folded it again and returned it. "This should have never reached you." "But it did." "Then forget it." "I can't." His eyes met hers, dark, unyielding, yet filled with something almost like regret. "This is not a path you can walk back from," he said softly. "Not once your feet have touched it." Sophie stepped closer, her voice trembling but resolute. "Is it true, what they say, that you help them?" Gabriel's silence answered her. She exhaled slowly. "Lisette told me." His gaze did not shift. "Then you already know too much. Then make it count." He tilted his head. "And what does the lady of the house propose? That she risk everything for a handful of strangers? For a handful of lives," she said. "Yes." The rain intensified against the stained glass, streaking color and shadow down the walls. Gabriel turned away, walking a few steps toward the altar. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. "You have no idea what you are asking," he said. "No understanding of what you would lose." "I've already lost more than I can name," she replied, her voice sharper than she intended. He looked at her then, truly looked, as if seeing not the silk-clad wife of a powerful man, but the woman beneath, stripped of pretense and permission. "If I give you a name," he said slowly, "if I ask you to carry a message, you must do so without question, without delay. You will not see me again for some time." She nodded. "This is not charity," he warned. "This is survival. There is no poetry here. Only danger. Still she nodded. Gabriel reached into his coat and retrieved a small slip of folded linen. Inside was a name, a location, a date. "When you are alone," he said, "burn it." Their eyes met again. She took the linen and pressed it against her palm. He moved past her toward the door, but before stepping outside, he turned back once more. "You should not trust me," he said, his voice low and rough. "But I hope one day you will understand why I trusted you." Then he vanished into the rain. Sophie remained alone in the chapel, the note pressed to her heart, the weight of his words echoing louder than thunder. She stayed there for what felt like hours. When she returned to the house, Lisette was waiting by the back entrance, arms folded, her apron damp from the evening's work. "Well?" she asked. Sophie handed her the parchment. Lisette's fingers closed around it gently, her face unreadable. "This won't be the last time," she said. Sophie said nothing. She didn't need to. That night, as the storm broke and passed, Sophie sat by the window, watching the world drip back into silence. In her lap was a handkerchief, damp from her hands. She did not cry. She did not pray. She simply listened. And in that quiet, something ancient stirred in her. Not rebellion, not love, but purpose. And it was louder than any bell she had ever heard ring. The night sky hung low over New Orleans, veiled in a gauze of silver mist and the soft shimmer of stars. Along the grand avenue leading to the Vallon estate, carriages rolled one after another, wheels clattering over cobblestones slick with evening dew. The moonlight struck the iron gates, where gas lanterns burned in anticipation, casting golden halos upon the marble lions that guarded the entrance like silent sentinels. The masked ball was the crowning jewel of Judge Horace Vallon's social calendar, a display of excess designed not only to impress, but to intimidate. The very walls of the mansion seemed to exhale privilege. Inside, the chandeliers glittered like frozen waterfalls, and the smell of lilac and tobacco lingered above the hum of violins. Servants in livery moved like clockwork, carrying trays of champagne and gilded sweets as if they were feeding gods. Sophie stood at the base of the grand staircase, dressed in a gown of midnight blue silk that clung to her waist before flaring into layers of tulle embroidered with jet beads. Her mask, made of delicate black lace and trimmed in tiny sapphires, obscured her face but not her gaze. Her hazel eyes scanned the room, alert beneath the veil of civility. Beside her, Charles adjusted the cuffs of his dove-grey evening coat, his own mask stiff and pristine, like everything else he wore. "You look radiant tonight," he murmured, placing a gloved hand at the small of her back. "Radiance can be a disguise," Sophie replied quietly, her voice wrapped in silk and steel. He glanced at her, searching for offense, but she had already begun her ascent into the ballroom. Judge Vallon greeted them with all the performance of a seasoned host. He bowed, kissed Sophie's gloved hand, and offered Charles a cordial nod. "I trust tonight finds you well, Madame Beaumont," Vallon said, his voice oiled with charm. "Perfectly," she lied with a smile. The ballroom was a kaleidoscope of silks and feathers, laughter and lies. Women moved like wraiths in powder and pearls. Men like shadows cloaked in politics and privilege. The music swelled, a haunting waltz that echoed beneath the vaulted ceiling, painted with allegories of justice and empire. Sophie's fingers curled lightly around her fan as she walked. Every word around her sounded like a whisper behind a locked door. She passed a group of men near the fireplace, their faces hidden beneath half masks of gold and ivory. One held a folded map, pointing with a gloved finger toward a darkened port marked Santiago de Cuba. The words were hushed, but the tone was urgent, transactional, dangerous. She paused near a table of wine glasses, pretending to examine a goblet as she tilted her head slightly, straining to hear. "The shipment departs next month," one of the men muttered, "but Vallon insists on rerouting through Havana. Less interference." "Fewer eyes," another replied, "especially now that New Orleans is growing louder." Her breath caught in her throat. They were not speaking of cotton or sugar. She stepped back, heart pounding, when the strings changed tempo and the crowd shifted like a tide toward the dance floor. And there he was, Gabriel. Even masked, he could not be mistaken. His coat was black, unembellished, the cut sharp and tailored. A silver half-mask covered the upper half of his face, but his mouth, firm, unreadable, was bare, as if daring the world to guess what lay behind his silence. He moved through the dancers with practiced restraint, never rushing, never lingering, and when his eyes found hers across the room, the space between them folded inward. He approached without fanfare, bowed, and extended his hand. "Would you grant this dance to a stranger?" he asked softly. "I've always preferred strangers," Sophie answered, placing her gloved hand in his. The music rose around them. They stepped into the waltz, two figures lost in a sea of motion and light. The crowd blurred, the chandeliers shimmered. But inside that rhythm, step, turn, breath, they found a language that required no translation. "You should not have come," she whispered as they turned. "I did not come for you," he lied. Her fingers tightened briefly in his. He continued, "There is a message in your sleeve. Give it to Lisette before dawn." "I saw a map," she murmured. "They're shipping through Cuba." "I know. How deep does it go?" "Deeper than your marriage," he said, "and far beyond Louisiana." They turned again. Her skirts flared, brushing the hem of his coat. "Why don't you run?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Because the people I protect can't." Their movements slowed. The final chords stretched, longing and uncertain, and then silence fell. Gabriel released her hand with care, stepped back, bowed once more, and disappeared into the crowd. As the applause scattered like confetti, Sophie stood alone in the center of the floor, her chest rising and falling beneath the silk of her bodice. Her mask itched against her cheek. Her skin burned with questions she did not yet have the courage to ask. She moved toward the terrace for air, the wind lifting her veil as she leaned against the marble balustrade. The moon was high now, casting its pale light over the misty gardens below. Somewhere, a nightbird called, a long, mournful note that echoed like a warning. Footsteps approached. Judge Vallon emerged beside her, holding a glass of brandy, his own mask pushed up to rest atop his powdered hair. "You dance beautifully," he said with a thin smile. Sophie turned slightly but said nothing. "Your partner," Vallon continued, "is a curious man, uninvited, unknown, dangerous." Her fingers tightened on the stone railing. "He's no one," she said. Vallon chuckled. "My dear, no one becomes someone the moment your eyes linger too long. Be careful, Madame Beaumont. Even masks reveal more than they hide." He finished his drink, then added with a glance toward the ballroom, "Your husband is watching, and your husband does not like to share." Sophie watched him go. From the second-floor balcony above, Charles stood like a statue carved in smoke and envy. His mask obscured half his face, but his jaw was clenched. His hands were folded tightly behind his back. She returned inside. But the echo of the dance, the map, and Vallon's warning followed her through the night like the rustle of silk in a darkened hallway, persistent, weightless, inescapable. And in her heart, Sophie no longer wondered whether she had crossed a line. She knew it, and there would be no return. The frost came early that winter. It crept in through the window panes in delicate webs and laced the courtyard in pale silver threads. The trees stood motionless beneath a sky drained of warmth, and the river beyond the property had turned quiet, as if waiting for something to break the stillness. Everything in New Orleans moved slower, as though time itself feared what it would uncover if it moved too quickly. Inside the Beaumont estate, the great rooms remained warm. Fires burned behind carved mantels, and footmen moved about with practiced grace, but a deeper chill had settled into the house. It hung in the halls, between glances and unsaid words, and it sat, day and night, in Sophie's chest. It had been only 3 nights since the masked ball at Judge Vallon's, but Sophie had not known rest since. Her dreams had become scattered flickers of maps, whispered names, and the sound of Gabriel's voice, low and unreadable, warning her of the line she had crossed. That line now had a name. Her name was Amélie. The girl could not have been older than 11. She had skin the color of polished acacia and hair braided in tight rows that had begun to unravel. Her eyes, wide and terrified, rarely blinked, as though closing them might erase her chance at survival. She had arrived at the back entrance of the estate before dawn, trembling, soaked from the bayou, clutching a torn scrap of linen with Sophie's name stitched into the corner. Gabriel had told Sophie once that if someone came bearing that name, she must act without hesitation. No questions, no delay. And so, without a word, Sophie had brought the child into the cellar, wrapped her in old quilts, and lit a single lamp. Lisette had come upon them not long after, and to Sophie's surprise, said nothing at first. She simply knelt beside the child, touched her damp forehead, and began to hum a lullaby Sophie did not recognize. Later, when Amélie finally slept beneath a makeshift bed of burlap and shawls, Lisette turned to Sophie with a look that was neither surprise nor judgment, only resolve. "I'll bring food at sundown," she said quietly, "and water before dawn." "Thank you," Sophie whispered. Lisette touched Sophie's hand briefly. "You're not just hiding a child, madame, you're hiding yourself." The days that followed were a blur of movements too careful and silences too loud. Sophie continued her routines by day, attending luncheons and embroidery circles, listening to gossip about gowns and garden renovations, while her mind remained far below the floorboards. She knew Gabriel would come. He always kept his promises. But each hour that passed brought new tension. And Charles, once distracted and aloof, had grown suddenly present. He watched her now, not with affection or even suspicion, but with calculation. At breakfast, he commented on her restlessness. "You look pale," he said over marmalade and toast. "Is something troubling you?" She smiled politely. "Only the weather, it's been biting." He did not blink. "You've always preferred the cold." Later that afternoon, she returned to her dressing chamber and found her journal moved an inch from where she had left it. It was small, bound in burgundy leather with a golden clasp, but its contents were not innocent. In it were phrases she dared not speak aloud, descriptions of the night at the river, her fears, her doubts, her glimpses of Gabriel, her growing awareness that the life she had married into was built on blood and shadows. She had been careless. Her fingers shook as she opened it and scanned the pages. Nothing had been torn, but the clasp was no longer locked. Downstairs, Charles stood at the parlor window, a glass of sherry in hand, watching the horizon. When she entered, he turned slightly, not enough to appear confrontational, but enough to make his presence known. "I had a conversation with Horace this morning," he said, his voice even. "Judge Vallon?" she asked, moving slowly toward the decanter to pour herself something, anything to occupy her hands. He mentioned the name Morel. Sophie's fingers stilled. She did not look up. "I've never met the man," Charles continued, "but Horace says he's been seen around the docks lately, too often for a man of letters." Sophie sipped her drink. "Perhaps he enjoys the view." Charles chuckled. "I imagine he does." There was a pause. Then too softly he added, "I've asked someone to follow him." She turned to him now, fully. To what end? To discover his nature. And if his nature is harmless? He studied her. No man who lingers in the dark is harmless. You of all people should understand that. Sophie felt her breath catch, but she did not flinch. "Be careful, Charles. Not all shadows belong to criminals. Some belong to the truth." He smiled thinly. "Then may the truth be patient. I'm arranging for an official inquiry through Judge Vallon. Nothing dramatic, just eyes in the right places." She left the room before he could see the terror rising behind her composure. That evening, Sophie and Lisette moved Amélie to the root cellar beneath the stables. It was colder, but more hidden. The child barely spoke, but she clutched Sophie's hand as they descended the wooden steps. The air smelled of earth and rust, But Sophie breathed easier once the door was bolted shut above them. "Tomorrow," she whispered to the girl. "He'll come for you tomorrow." Amélie nodded, her face pressed against Sophie's skirts. Back inside, Sophie returned to her chamber and locked the door behind her. She retrieved her journal, tore every page into thin strips, and fed them one by one into the fireplace. Her hands shook, not with fear, but with fury. She was done pretending to be something delicate. A woman's worth was not in her silence, not in her obedience. It was in the fire she kept hidden behind her ribs. As the last piece of paper curled into ash, she looked at her reflection in the mirror. Her skin was pale, her eyes tired, but they no longer looked away. They burned, and what they saw was a house of cards about to fall. The rain returned with a vengeance, drenching the streets of New Orleans in relentless sheets that blurred the outlines of the world. The city, usually vibrant even in its sins, now seemed hushed, bowed under the weight of clouds and silence. Church bells rang in the distance, muffled by the storm, their notes fractured by the wind. It was on such a morning, thick with dread and damp with foreboding, that Gabriel Morel was taken. He had gone to the southern edge of the Port District, beneath the crumbling stone arches of an abandoned carriage house, to meet a trusted contact, an older man whose niece had been smuggled out to safety weeks earlier. It was to be a brief exchange, a list of names, a date, a plan to move two families through the swamps before the season changed. But they were waiting for him. 3 men, masked, paid, and impatient. He had no time to run. By the time Gabriel fell to the ground, his coat soaked and torn, blood running from a split above his brow, he already knew who had betrayed him. It wasn't the old man. It wasn't even a spy. It was power. The kind that wore a judge's robes and smiled at Gallus. The kind that shook hands with planters and signed orders behind velvet curtains. The kind that drank brandy while deciding who would disappear before dawn. When Sophie heard the news, it came not from Charles, but from Lisette, breathless and soaked, her headscarf clinging to her scalp and her eyes red from weeping. "They have him," she whispered, closing the parlor door behind her. "At the prison on Chartres Street. I heard from Elias. He saw the guards dragging him through the mud like a dog." Sophie stood motionless, one hand clutching the corner of the escritoire for balance. The world around her seemed to tilt, colors blurring at the edges. "He's alive?" she asked. Lisette nodded. "But they hurt him." Sophie's voice broke. "Then I'm going to him." "No." The voice came from behind them, firm, calm, rehearsed. Charles stood at the threshold, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable. "You will do no such thing," he said. Sophie turned to him slowly, the fire in her spine rising like a tide. "You would deny me the right to offer comfort to a man you helped put in chains?" Charles did not blink. "I deny you the right to parade your foolishness in front of the entire city. Do you think people are not watching? That I have not already been asked about your curious interest in this poet-turned-criminal?" Sophie stepped toward him. "You betrayed a man who fights for the voiceless. What does that make you?" He stared at her for a long moment, his voice low and smooth. A husband trying to protect his wife. She laughed, bitter and broken. "No, you're not trying to protect me. You're trying to erase me." Charles's jaw tightened. "You will not leave this estate until further notice, and you will not speak to that man again." Then he turned, as if the matter were closed. But Sophie did not retreat. She waited until nightfall. Then, dressed in the simplest cloak she owned, and with Lisette at her side, she slipped through the service gate and disappeared into the rain. The prison stood like a beast of stone and iron, its barred windows flickering with torchlight. The air around it smelled of rust and rot, and the guards at the door sneered when she arrived with a basket of food and a pouch of coins. "I bring nourishment for a prisoner," she said, lifting her chin. One of the men spat on the cobblestones. "He don't need bread, lady, he needs repentance." But another guard, older and quieter, eyed her finely made gloves and the silver edge of her brooch. "He's down the corridor." he said. "No longer bleeding, but don't expect him to look like a gentleman." They led her through damp halls lined with voices, some shouting, some praying, some singing softly to themselves in languages long forgotten. When she reached the cell, the light was poor, the shadows heavy, but she knew him. He sat on the floor, back against the wall, one arm limp at his side, his shirt stained with dried blood. His face was bruised, his lips split, but his eyes still burned. "Sophie," he whispered. Her name from his lips was a psalm, a lament, a promise. She knelt beside him, setting the basket down, her fingers trembling as she unwrapped a cloth and offered him water. He drank in silence. For a long time they said nothing. Then quietly, Gabriel asked, "Did he hurt you?" She shook her head. "He tried," she said, "but I'm not his to break." He smiled barely. "You are not anyone's." She reached for his hand, their fingers meeting between the bars. "You trusted me once," she said. "Let me repay that." "You already have." His voice was hoarse but steady. Sophie leaned forward, resting her forehead against the cold iron. "There must be a way to fight this," she said. "To fight them." "There is always a way," he replied. "But the cost is never paid in coin." They stayed like that, fingers entwined through the bars until the guard returned. "Time's up." Sophie rose slowly. Her skirts were damp, her cloak heavy with rain. She looked back at Gabriel once more. "I will not let them silence you," she said. His smile was a shadow of its former self, but it was real. "They've already failed." As she left the prison, the night seemed darker than before, the rain colder. But in her chest, something burned. Not hope, no, not yet, but defiance. When she returned to the estate, Charles was waiting in the drawing room, the fire casting long shadows behind him. "You disobeyed me," he said. "I chose humanity over obedience." His eyes narrowed. "You forget yourself." "No." Her voice did not shake. "I'm remembering who I was before you told me what I should be." He crossed the room in 2 steps and seized her arm, but she did not pull away. "Let go," she said, her tone low and lethal. "Unless you wish the servants to witness their master reduced to a coward." He released her. She walked away without looking back. The next morning, Lisette was stopped by 2 men near the market, strangers in coats too fine for common business, their questions sharp and their threats sharper. But Lisette, with her head held high and her heart steady, simply said, "Tell Judge Vallon, I don't shake for paper men with bloodless hands." And she walked on. For in that city of fog and whispers, where power was traded like silk and silence was bought with fear, 2 women refused to kneel. And from that refusal, the wind began to shift. The courthouse stood like a fortress of judgment in the heart of the quarter, its tall columns streaked with grime and rain, its stones older than the city's sins. That morning, the square outside teemed with bodies, men in top hats murmuring in clusters, women in gloves clenching handkerchiefs with white-knuckled hands, laborers who had never seen the inside of a courtroom pressing up against the steps for a glimpse of the spectacle unfolding within. And it was a spectacle, not a trial, not justice, just performance dressed in the robes of law. Inside the main chamber, the air was heavy with candle smoke and damp wool. The oak benches were full. The balcony overflowed with whispers, every seat occupied by citizens who had come not for the truth, but for the drama of its destruction. There were no tears, no compassion, only expectation. Sophie sat near the front, her eyes fixed on the man in chains. Gabriel. He stood tall despite the bruises that marred his jaw and temple, despite the shackles that clinked with every movement. His coat had been taken. His shirt was rumpled, stained, unworthy of his dignity. And yet, he wore defiance like a crown. Judge Horace Vallon sat upon his bench like a relic from another age, powdered and pressed, his pale eyes scanning the room with performative indifference. But Sophie knew better. She had seen the letters. She had overheard the dealings, and she recognized the way he avoided meeting Gabriel's gaze, as if doing so might turn him to stone. The prosecution called its first witness, a man with a voice too loud and a face too clean. He claimed he had seen Gabriel passing messages to dock workers, claimed he had overheard him speaking of uprising, of corruption, of freedom by fire. Sophie looked at him and saw only a liar in borrowed boots. More followed, each more absurd than the last. A merchant's wife who said Gabriel once refused to bow to her husband in public. A clerk who claimed he had seen Gabriel near the governor's carriage, scribbling in a journal with menace. When Charles was called, the room shifted. He took the stand with the ease of a man who had rehearsed each word like scripture. His mask of concern was perfectly crafted, his tone grave, his eyes lowered in false regret. "I had hoped Monsieur Morel was simply misunderstood," he said smoothly, "but I can no longer ignore the pattern of secrecy, the late-night disappearances, the influence he has exerted over impressionable minds." His eyes flickered toward Sophie, brief, calculated. "She has a generous heart," he added, "and men like this one know how to manipulate such hearts." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Sophie's hands curled into fists in her lap, her nails biting her palms, but she did not look away. Gabriel's eyes remained steady, locked on the back of Charles's skull like a blade. After the session adjourned for recess, Sophie moved quickly through the corridor, her skirts brushing marble, her steps quiet but purposeful. She found him alone in a side room, standing before a window that overlooked the courtyard. When she stepped in, he didn't turn. "You lied," she said. Still, he didn't move. "You dragged a man through the mud and dared to soil my name with him. You put poetry on trial and called it treason. Tell me, Charles, how much did the judge charge for that performance?" Finally, he turned. His expression was no longer controlled. It was furious. "I warned you," he said in a low voice. "I told you what would happen if you kept entertaining those illusions of yours, and now you've made me your enemy." "You were always my enemy," she replied. The strike came fast. It wasn't the first time she had imagined it, his hand rising, his fury unchecked, but when it landed across her cheek, it didn't burn the way she thought it would. It froze, and when she looked up at him again, her eyes did not water. They blazed. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now I know the mask has finally slipped." He took a step back, uncertain. She left the room without another word. That night, Lisette brought the key. "The judge's office is on the second floor of the archives," she said. "He keeps the private records in the cabinet behind the bust of Marcus Aurelius." Sophie dressed in plain clothes and wrapped her hair beneath a dark shawl. The city was quieter at night. Rain slicked the cobblestones, and the gaslights flickered against the fog. They moved like shadows through back alleys, hearts pounding in unison. The door opened with a reluctant creak. Inside, the judge's chambers smelled of old paper, dust, and arrogance. Everything was too polished, too perfect. But behind the bust, just as Lisette said, was a narrow cabinet locked with brass. Lisette handed her the second key. Inside were ledgers bound in brown leather, letters tied with string, and a small stack of envelopes bearing Charles's seal. Sophie opened one. Her breath caught. It detailed payment orders to a man in Santiago de Cuba, outlining shipments disguised as agricultural cargo, but listing names, ages, and brands. Human beings reduced to ink and coin. She gathered everything. Before dawn, she slipped the evidence into a parcel and delivered it to a weathered townhouse in the Rue Toulouse. It was the home of Monsieur Armand Lavigne, an editor known for publishing what others were paid to forget. He opened the door with suspicion until he saw the contents of the envelope. He didn't ask for her name. He simply said, "You have just declared war." She returned home as the first light touched the horizon. Her cloak soaked, her face marked by the bruise Charles had given her, but her hands did not tremble. Later that morning, in the courtroom, Gabriel stood to hear the charges repeated. But outside, a storm was gathering. This time, not of wind or rain. It was a storm of truth, lit by fire, guided by a woman who had remembered her worth. And in the silence before the gavel fell, Sophie raised her eyes to Gabriel's and gave the smallest, most defiant nod. A promise. The battle had begun. It began with the ink, dark as blood, fresh on parchment, stretched across the front page of Le Courrier Créole like a crack of thunder across a still sky. The headline shouted without mercy, "Trade in chains, judge and planter exposed in illegal slavering." Beneath it, names, transactions, letters, signatures, and truths that clawed their way out of the shadows after too long in silence. New Orleans awoke to it like a city slapped. Market stalls fell silent, parlors buzzed in hushed tones. The governor's mansion locked its doors to visitors. On the streets, men clutched the paper with trembling hands, their cravats forgotten, their coffee gone cold. Women gasped behind fans and corsets. A few fainted, but none could unsee it. Judge Vallon, Charles Beaumont, two pillars of Southern society, unmasked, dismantled, ruined by a handful of stolen pages, and a woman who had lost everything except her will. Sophie stood on the veranda of the Beaumont estate as the bells rang 10. Her gloved hands were folded in front of her, still and calm. She wore a deep burgundy daydress, buttoned to her throat, the color rich and grave. Her hair was pinned high. Her eyes were unreadable. Lisette stood beside her, holding a folded copy of the paper against her chest. "People are watching the house," she murmured. "They should," Sophie replied. "Let them see what they helped build." The clatter of hooves on gravel broke the stillness. Charles's carriage, black as morning, swung through the gate, its wheels cutting sharp into the soil. He did not wait for the driver to assist him. He leapt down before the horses had fully stopped, his coat flapping like the wings of a wounded hawk. The front door slammed open. "Sophie!" She turned slowly, her steps measured. Inside, the air felt scorched, as if fire had already begun its work. He stood in the foyer, face mottled red, the newspaper crumpled in his fist. "What have you done?" he seethed. "What needed to be done?" "You traitorous," he choked on the word, breath caught between fury and disbelief. "You've destroyed everything, my name, my business, my reputation." She walked past him, unflinching. "You destroyed those long before I did," she said. "I simply held up the mirror." He grabbed her wrist, hard, his grip bruised, his eyes wild. "You dare speak to me like that, after I gave you a name, a life, a place among women who mattered?" Sophie turned to face him fully. "I was never yours to place, Charles. And your name?" She leaned in, her voice a whisper made of knives. "It now means nothing." He struck her again, but this time she did not stagger. She looked into his eyes, into the hollow void where love should have lived, and said clearly, "You are already dead to me." Silence fell. Even the house seemed to hold its breath. Charles's hand dropped. His face twisted, not with regret, but with the fury of a man realizing his control had slipped from his grasp like ash through fingers. Without another word, Sophie walked away. By nightfall, the estate was surrounded, not by constables, nor by the curious elite, but by shadows, men with grudges, smugglers whose routes had been compromised, associates betrayed by Charles's cowardice. One of them, masked in a kerchief soaked with sweat and whiskey, hurled a glass bottle against the side of the barn. It shattered on impact. Then the flames began. First the stable, then the storage house, then the rear wing, where Charles kept his ledgers and bourbon. Sophie stood in her bedchamber, calm in the flickering light of the blaze. Lisette appeared, her face streaked with smoke. "It's time." Sophie nodded and reached into her drawer. From it, she retrieved a simple leather cord. Attached to it was a wooden cross pendant, Gabriel's. "He gave me this when he thought he wouldn't survive," she said softly. Lisette placed her hand over Sophie's. "Then let's make sure he does." They moved quickly, using the hidden servant corridor that twisted beneath the house like a buried artery. The path was tight, the air damp with age and soot. Behind them the heat grew unbearable. The flames crackled like applause. In the stables, Charles had emerged with a pistol in one hand and blood on his temple. He shouted to men who no longer obeyed him. He fired once, blindly, into the smoke. Then he staggered toward the fire, cursing the name of every man who had ever shaken his hand. He was last seen limping into the inferno, a figure swallowed whole by the consequences of his own making. The next morning, there was no body, only smoke, rubble, and the charred remains of a legacy built on bones. Judge Vallon, meanwhile, had not returned to his chambers. Word spread that he had boarded a steamer bound for Havana under a false name. By noon, a formal inquiry had begun. By dusk, his home had been vandalized with ink and bricks. But none of that mattered to Sophie, as she stepped through the threshold of the carriage house near the edge of town. The building was dark, but in the corner, behind a stack of crates, stood a man with firelight dancing in his eyes. Gabriel. His arm was still wrapped in a sling, his lip still bruised. But when he saw her, he stood straighter. She moved to him in silence, and without a word, she placed the pendant in his hand. He stared at it, then at her. "How?" he asked. She smiled, weary but unbroken, with purpose. Outside, the wind shifted, and in the city of masks, fire, and reckoning, a woman who had once been owned by a name now stood unnamed, unchained, and unafraid. The sky had not yet decided what kind of day it would be. A pale, silver light stretched timidly across the horizon, bathing New Orleans in the hush that lingers before dawn. The city still slept beneath a blanket of damp fog, its rooftops veiled, its streets hollow with silence. Even the birds had not begun their song. Sophie walked alone. She wore no gloves, no bonnet, no silk. Only a plain wool cloak, fastened tightly at the neck, and a shawl that smelled faintly of smoke and lavender. Her boots pressed softly into the dew-damp grass as she followed the familiar path down the hill, toward the chapel by the river. It was the same path she had walked in fear so many months ago. Then she had trembled with uncertainty, hiding behind trees, watching the man she had once loved seal the fate of strangers with a flick of his pen. Now her hands did not tremble, her steps did not falter, but her heart ached with the weight of hope. There had been no word from Gabriel since the fire, only whispers from Lisette's contacts, half-formed rumors of a man seen crossing the bayou under cover of night. A wounded man with a voice like thunder wrapped in velvet. A man who had vanished before the city awoke to find its sins displayed on newsprint. He had disappeared, and though Sophie had helped orchestrate his freedom, she had not seen him, had not touched him, had not heard the sound of her name on his lips since the night everything crumbled. Now, as she approached the stone chapel nestled between the trees, she feared the worst, that he had gone, that her silence had cost her more than she could bear. The chapel stood unchanged, weather-worn, humble, eternal, a place of hiding, of confession, of beginnings too fragile to name. Moss clung to its edges like lace. The door was closed. The windows were dark. She hesitated, then pushed the door open with both hands. The interior was bathed in early light, streaks of gold cutting through the dust and striking the old pews like blessings. The scent of damp wood and melted wax filled the air, but the room was empty. She stepped inside, her breath shallow. The memory of their first meeting here clung to the walls like a phantom. The whisper of his voice, the way he had looked at her, not as a wife, not as a possession, but as something untamed, something sacred. She closed her eyes. "Gabriel, I came to say goodbye," she whispered into the stillness. "But I'm not ready." She took a few more steps, each one echoing in the hollow space. Her hand reached into the folds of her cloak and found what she had carried with her for weeks, a leather cord and a wooden pendant, carved by hand, worn smooth with time. The only thing of his she had kept. She pressed it to her lips. And then, from behind the last pew, a sound, the soft scrape of a boot against stone. She turned. He was there, leaning slightly against the far wall, his left arm still in a sling, his coat faded and frayed at the hem. His face was thinner, his beard fuller, his eyes sunken with the shadows of pain, but alive, undeniably, painfully alive. He said nothing at first, neither did she. He took one step forward. "I thought you were gone," she said, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with the unbearable ache of relief. "I nearly was," he replied. "I was waiting for the right silence." She moved closer. "You didn't send word." "I couldn't." He looked at her then fully, and she saw it, the fear, not for himself, for her. "I thought if you came," he said, "it would only be to say goodbye." Sophie stepped toward him slowly until there was only breath between them. "I don't want to say goodbye." He looked away, jaw clenched. "Sophie," he began, but she raised her hand and placed her fingers gently against his mouth. "Don't," she whispered. "Not yet." He took her hand, holding it between both of his. "I can't ask you to choose this," he said, "to live in exile, in hiding, to give up the world you were born into." She smiled then, softly, but with fire. "I'm not giving up anything," she said. "I'm claiming something that was never mine to begin with." She reached into her cloak and lifted the pendant. Gabriel's breath caught. She stepped forward and lifted it to his neck, her fingers brushing the skin at his collarbone, cool from the morning air. She tied the cord carefully, the knot firm, then met his eyes. "I choose you," she said. "I choose truth." For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then Gabriel pulled her to him with his good arm, and she fell into his embrace as if it were home. He held her tightly, as if anchoring himself to the one thing that had not betrayed him. Her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek resting over his heart. Their bodies did not speak in heat or haste, but in something deeper, an ache, a question finally answered. He kissed her forehead first, then her temple, then finally her lips. It was not desperate. It was not rehearsed. It was the kiss of two people who had walked through fire and chosen not to burn. When they parted, the sun had risen fully, its rays breaking through the chapel's window and bathing the floor in gold. Sophie turned toward it, letting the light touch her face. "I was once afraid of mornings," she said quietly. "And now?" Gabriel asked. "Now," she whispered, "I know I will never wake alone again." He took her hand. They stood together in the light, the past behind them, the river flowing beyond the trees, and the city below still stirring from its slumber. But in that quiet chapel, surrounded by ash and faith, Sophie Beaumont ceased to exist. And in her place, a woman stood, unbranded, unbroken, unafraid. She was no longer anyone's possession. She was her own beginning, and that morning was not the end. It was the last sunrise before freedom. 6 months had passed, not rushed, not slow, simply lived. And in those days, stitched together by quiet hours, warm bread, soft laughter, and the steady pulse of water against reed and root, Sophie learned how silence could heal instead of haunt. Their home stood modest and strong at the edge of the swamp, tucked between tall cypress trees and thick curtains of Spanish moss. It was a wooden structure built by Gabriel's hands and shaped by Sophie's care. The floor creaked gently underfoot, the windows opened wide to the world, and the roof held the sound of rain like a lullaby. It was nothing like the grand halls she had once walked, and because of that, it was everything. Each morning began the same way, not with bells, not with servants, but with birdsong and the scent of chicory coffee rising from the hearth. Gabriel would rise first, quietly, as if still unsure the world would let him stay. He moved with the weight of someone who had once been hunted, but now carried peace in his pockets. Sophie would wake soon after, wrapped in a linen shift, her hair loose down her back, her skin warmed not by silks, but by sun and the nearness of the man beside her. They no longer whispered in fear. They no longer flinched when the wind changed direction. They listened to it, And sometimes, in the stillness before dusk, Sophie would sit by the small writing desk in the corner of the room, reading the latest column from Le Courrier Créole. Always unsigned, but always unmistakable in voice. Lisette's. The woman who once served her now served justice, word by word, paragraph by paragraph. Her writing pierced the city like sunlight through fog, her stories woven with the strength of those who could not speak for themselves. She had become the city's conscience, dressed not in lace or velvet, but in ink. The people did not know her name, but they read her truths. Sometimes Sophie would laugh softly, reading one of Lisette's more scathing lines aloud. Gabriel would raise his eyes from whatever piece of wood he was carving and ask, "Was that our Lisette again?" And Sophie would nod. "She's bolder with every page." "So are you," he'd reply. They worked quietly during the days. Sophie kept a small garden. Gabriel worked with the local Creole families and free black farmers, organizing safe travel for those still in danger, helping them vanish from maps and memories until the world caught up with their right to exist. At night, they spoke little, not from weariness, but from understanding. They would sit on the porch, sharing a bowl of okra stew or the last slice of cornbread. The night would wrap around them like a shawl, and sometimes Gabriel would reach for his guitar, his fingers still healing but eager, and play something low, slow, and aching. And Sophie would close her eyes. For the first time in her life, she no longer counted losses in the dark. She counted blessings. And though the house bore no mirrors, none were needed, she had memorized the face of the woman she had become. Her eyes were steadier now, her voice deeper, not in tone, but in gravity. Her beauty no longer belonged to ballrooms or brooches. It belonged to her, to the lines at the corner of her mouth, etched by both weeping and smiling, to the muscles in her hands, strong from tilling the earth and holding the future, to the skin on her shoulders, kissed bronze by the sun without apology. One morning, just before the first heat of the day settled in, Gabriel entered the room with 2 tin mugs of coffee and a folded paper under his arm. He set them down and sat beside her at the edge of the bed. "She wrote another piece," he said, unfolding the paper. "This one about Vallon's last deal." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "He was seen again?" Gabriel nodded. "Not in New Orleans, but someone recognized his voice in Veracruz. He's trying to do business under another name." Sophie took a slow sip from the mug. "Even rats resurface eventually. She says the paper will publish the full dossier next week, with dates and names." Sophie smiled. "I'm proud of her," she said. Gabriel looked at her, the morning sun casting gold on his skin. "She learned from you." They said nothing more for a moment. Then Sophie stood, stretched, and went to the small wooden armoire where she kept her things. From the top drawer, she retrieved the shawl Gabriel's mother had once embroidered, the same one she had wrapped around herself the morning she first saw him as more than a stranger in a chapel. She draped it over her shoulders, turned to him, and held out her hand. "Come walk with me." He rose without hesitation. They stepped outside, hand in hand, into the breath of the morning. The cypress trees whispered their greetings as they passed. The wildflowers bent toward the sun. The earth beneath their feet was soft, damp with dew. They moved together in silence toward the chapel by the river, a different one, smaller, made of wood and patience, built not with stone and sermons, but with faith. It had no bell, no altar, only a bench facing the water where light touched everything like a promise. They sat. Sophie exhaled. The river moved slowly, lazily, no longer the current that once carried her into fear. It shimmered, reflecting the pinks and golds of the sky. Gabriel's hand tightened slightly in hers. She looked around. There was no fog, no blood, no betrayal, only water and trees and breath. Gabriel turned to her. "Do you miss the city?" Sophie shook her head. "No. Do you miss who you were?" She looked down at their hands, one darker, one lighter, both calloused now, both marked by work and will. "No," she said, "because I was never her." He smiled. You were always you. The world just had its hand over your mouth. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and now he rested his cheek against her hair. Now you speak. They sat like that, unmoving, as the day unfolded around them. Somewhere far off a child laughed. A rooster crowed, a barge whistled faintly downriver. But here, in this sacred hush between sun and soul, there was no need for sound, only presence. And when Sophie closed her eyes, she no longer saw burning ledgers or twisted names or shadows whispering in courthouse halls. She saw freedom, not as a place, but as a choice. And when she opened her eyes again to the golden spill of light across the water, she smiled. For the first time in her life, she did not fear what dawn would bring. The summer of 1845 came with heavy rains and longer days, and with it a kind of stillness that only comes to those who have survived storms both outside and within. The world had changed, and so had they. The little house by the swamp still stood. Weathered, softened by time, kissed by moss and sun. Its shutters creaked now when the wind rose, and the floorboards sang their own lullaby beneath the feet of children too young to know what sorrow had once lived within those walls. A boy and a girl, twins, born in the same storm that broke the levees 3 years prior, ran barefoot through the tall grass, their laughter as loud and wild as the frogs that echoed back at them. The boy, Etienne, had Gabriel's quiet eyes and Sophie's fire. The girl, Camille, had Sophie's mouth and Gabriel's strength. They were light and shadow, wind and river, two pieces of the same miracle Sophie once believed she would never hold in her arms. Gabriel sat on the porch, whittling a wooden horse. His hands were older now, slower. A scar near his thumb still reminded him of chains he had once broken for others. His beard had threads of silver, and his shoulders ached more often. But when he looked up and saw Sophie emerge from the garden, dirt on her apron, a flower tucked behind her ear, his heart still caught breath like it did the first time she had whispered his name in the dark. They had loved each other through hunger and harvest, through births and burials. There had been seasons when Gabriel disappeared for weeks at a time, guiding families through treacherous paths north, and Sophie would wait with her hand on the windowsill, her soul steady even when her body trembled. There had been days when Sophie collapsed with grief, learning of friends who never escaped, of girls who didn't make it through the night. And Gabriel had held her in silence, letting her sorrow wash over them both like baptism. Their love was not perfect. It was something better. It endured. Lisette visited often, never with fanfare. She had remained in the city, still writing, her name still unknown to the public, but spoken like a secret prayer in the corners of churches and kitchens alike. Her columns had forced 2 resignations in the legislature, exposed 4 trafficking rings, and protected countless lives. She never married. When asked why, she would smile and say, "There is more than one kind of family." Every time she visited Sophie, she brought books for the children and stories for their mother. They would sit on the porch until the stars arrived, remembering the women they used to be and marveling at the ones they had become. As for Charles Beaumont, no body was ever found. No grave, no marker, just the echo of a name too dangerous to speak and too hollow to remember. Some say he fled to Brazil under another name. Others say he died in the fire. Sophie never searched. She had already buried him, in memory, in meaning, in the ashes of everything he tried to control. Judge Vallon's name, once spoken with reverence, had become a cautionary tale. No law could reach him across the ocean, but the shame did. He lived in exile, a ghost in satin cuffs, pacing foreign balconies with no audience to applaud him. The world had moved on without him, and the world had moved on. The year before, the city of New Orleans passed a local ordinance prohibiting the buying and selling of enslaved persons within parish limits. It was not enough, not by any means, but it was a crack in the wall, a first breath, a tremble in the foundation of a world built on suffering. Gabriel had cried when he heard the news. So had Sophie. Now, on this late summer evening, Sophie stood at the edge of the river with Camille's small hand in hers. The water was golden, the sky bruised with dusk. Etienne raced toward them with muddy feet and a butterfly cupped gently in his palms. "Maman," he called. "Look." She crouched down, brushing hair from his brow, her eyes soft with awe. "That's not just a butterfly," she said. "That's a promise with wings." Gabriel watched them from the porch, his carving long forgotten on the step beside him. He placed a hand over his heart, where the wooden cross pendant still rested beneath his shirt. Sophie looked back at him and smiled. The same smile she had given him the day she chose truth over safety. The same smile she had worn when she handed him his mother's pendant. The same smile she would wear for the rest of her life. The wind picked up, rustling the reeds. And in that moment, beneath the vast Louisiana sky, surrounded by the people she loved and the land that had tried to both bury and birth her, Sophie closed her eyes and breathed in the dusk. She had lost so much. She had fought for more. And now she had everything: peace, family, freedom. And for the first time in forever, she did not dream of escape. She dreamed of mourning. Sophie's journey began with silence, fear and uncertainty, but through fire, betrayal and love she rose. She learned that true strength is not loud. It is quiet, unwavering, and often hidden in the smallest acts of courage. In a time when women were expected to obey and remain still, she listened to the beating of her own heart and followed it into the unknown. This story is not just about forbidden love or dangerous secrets. It's about freedom, the kind that begins inside your soul. It's about what it costs to speak the truth and how sometimes choosing what is right over what is easy can rewrite a destiny. And now, dear listener, we turn to you. If Sophie's story moved you, if it lingered in your chest like the last note of a song, leave us a comment below. We'd love to know what part touched your heart the most. And if you made it all the way to the end, type the word dawn in the comments. It's our little secret, a sign that you too believe in second chances and new beginnings. And if you feel called to support the amazing team behind these emotional journeys, you can now send a super thanks right here on YouTube. Any amount you choose helps us keep bringing these powerful stories to life. But even if you can't contribute financially, you can still help us in a beautiful way by sharing this video with a friend, a sister, a mother, someone who needs to be reminded that light always follows the darkness. If you enjoyed Sophie's story, don't miss the other unforgettable romances I've linked in the cards above. They're waiting for you with open arms and beating hearts. Thank you for listening, for feeling, for believing. Until the next story, may your soul always choose truth, and may your heart never fear the dawn.